IVM.
Can professors make for great entrepreneurs? Thanks to our guest today, this is no longer a purely academic question in India. Listen to Dr. Vijay Chandru of Strand Life Sciences talk to us about his life from academia to industry, from AI to precision medicine on today's episode of the Pragati Podcast. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, international relations, and economics. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Joining me as my co-host today is Shambhavi Naik, fellow at the Takshashila Institution who works on biotech and policy. Our guest today is Vijay Chandru, co-founder and chairman of Strand Life Sciences. With a stellar academic career at Purdue and the Indian Institute of Science, Dr. Chandru, along with a few of his colleagues, became some of the first academic entrepreneurs in India. We have him on the show today to talk about his journey and about the many things that he has worked on in his life, from AI to cancer research to DNA sequencing to precision medicine. Before that, Kannada Barutta, I co-host the Tele Harte Kannada Podcast, a weekly show that connects Bengaluru, Karnataka and the world. Our latest episodes unpack the Indian and Karnataka government budgets. Do check them out, the link is in the description. Banni, Harte Hodeyona. We'll be back with Vijay Chandru and Shambhavi Naik after this short break.
Hello, everybody. It's been another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. Please follow us on social media if you aren't. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus talks to comedian Neville Shah about going to the same school as Freddie Mercury and how difficulties in life make for great comedic material. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by the very first guest he had on his podcast. Mahavir Chopra is the Director of Health, Life and Strategic Initiatives at CoverFox. They talk about new online ULIPs and why they're worth your investment. On How to Citizen, Meghnad and Shreya speak to comedian Abbas Momin, that's our very own Abbas, about understanding laws. They try to understand our free speech laws and what exactly is dissent. On the Filter Coffee podcast, animal activist Anand Siva joins Karthik Nagarajan to talk about animal cruelty and environmental conservation. On Geek Fruit, Tejas and Dinkar are joined by producer Janam to discuss the mind-effing films of Christopher Nolan. They talk about his beginnings, his first films, and the moment where he became the modern-day god of cinema. We have a Valentine's Day special on Advertising is Dead. Varun's guest is none other than his wife Pooja Johri, who is also CEO at The Glitch. They talk about how they balance their personal and professional lives, how she's made creative people work under a structure, and a lot more. On Golgappa, Rajshri Deshpande of Sacred Games fame talks to Tripti Kamkar about taking up challenging roles as an actor and her social work initiatives. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Welcome back. Hi, Dr. Chandru. Welcome to the show. Dr. Chandru, could you tell us about your journey in academia and to industry? Now you are the chairman of Strand Life Sciences. You started it. But before that, you were professor at Purdue and at IISc, right? So tell us a little about where you started and we'll eventually get to what all you've done
Sure.
in the process.
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having me on this podcast. I'm happy to talk about the journey. I think, so I would say that from the late 70s, for about 15 years, actually closer to maybe till about the mid-90s, the journey was largely about my interests in, I would say, computational mathematics. And I was really sort of deeply driven by academic research, aspirations and so on, first as a student and then as a younger faculty member. So to begin with, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of excitement in computational mathematics about finding more efficient algorithms for solving problems like linear programming and optimization problems of various kinds. And I think, that was the period in which Narendra Karmakar and Khachiyan from the Soviet Union sort of had breakthroughs, and many of us got involved in a lot of that kind of work. And that continued into my early work at Purdue as a young assistant professor. And so that was actually a period in which I would say I was learning the tools of the trade, for being able to work in computer science and applications of computer science. And that methodological approach continued for a while. I, at Purdue, started interacting with people who are very interested in geometric representations on the computer.
Okay.
And so this took me into a field known as computational geometry. And so again, various aspects of that, which got into some very sort of fascinating areas of classical, conic sections and, all the way to uh, things called cycloids and Gleichstick and so on. And all within this whole framework of mathematics, one was always looking at algorithmic questions, how to build efficient computational tools around those. And then I got very interested in rule-based artificial intelligence or rule-based logic questions, and deductive logic was seen to be the driver for artificial intelligence. This is long before machine learning and so on sort of became the mainstay.
So this is sort of creating a rule engine.
Rule engines where you could, set out a set of axioms and derive theorems that would be through deductive logic principles and so on. And how you could mechanize this was called automated theorem proving.
Okay.
And automated theorem proving was thought to be the main driver for intelligent systems and artificial intelligence. There were logic programming languages coming up and various formalisms in logic. And so that almost I worked on for 7-8 years, actually wrote a book on that with Professor John Hooker of Carnegie Mellon, and which essentially was more like a monograph that detailed a lot of our own research and the field as it was developing, right? And so as I mentioned, I think this whole period for me was really a period of getting trained and building the tools of the trade, so to speak. By about the early 90s, when I'd returned to India to take up the position in the Indian Institute of Science, I was teaching courses around my expertise, and some students from biology, actually from the molecular biophysics unit at IISc, which is of course the legendary department because of people like G.N. Ramachandran, Shashi Shekharan, and others. There was some younger faculty who sent their students over to computer science to talk to us to see if we could tell them new ways of computing. Things like macromolecular surfaces, the skin of a molecule, various volumetric computations that had to do as surrogates for energy representations, which then connected into problems of protein folding and protein conformations and so on. So that was my sort of first introduction to work in biology. And again, it was again driven by the fact that I had some of the tools that they could use, and a sort of symbiotic relationship started. Incidentally,
this was in the 90s.
I would say in the mid 90s, right?
Okay.
And
because by the mid 2000s, these were things we learned in courses about how, you have hydrophobic parts of proteins which collapse, and there are all these calculations.
All of that was already known to the structural biologists. But I think the idea of using advanced computational methods to actually compute these more accurately and more efficiently was what they had come to me for.
And even that, I think by the mid 2000s had become programs that one could plug and play with.
Absolutely.
And so on.
Absolutely. There were companies like Accelerist, Tripos, and so on, which actually gave you software for that, right? Now, all of this interaction with the biologists was actually very intriguing. Incidentally, I also had the privilege of interacting with Professor G.N. Ramachandran. This was more in the late 80s, early 90s. And he had some interest in logic. So it was really not about biology, but more about computational logic that we had interacted. So in the mid-90s, when this whole interface between computer science and biology started developing, a few of us in the computer science department decided to make a formal sort of interdisciplinary initiative, right? So we organized a discussion meeting funded by the Jawaharlal Nehru Center, where we actually invited biologists, computer scientists, and actually started this kind of dialogue. This was all still very academic. I don't think there was the thought that this would all lead to a company like Strand or anything. But it was, it was the start of that interest in computational biology. And by then, the faculty at the Indian Institute of Science had grown. Professor V. Vinay and Swami Manohar and Ramesh Hariharan and I had put a lab together, which we called the Perceptual Computing Lab. And so we actually had an interest in working on applications of various kinds using computational methods. And so this interest group in computational biology then started off first as seminars and workshops and so on. And then we gradually found that, it might be fun to actually work with the biotech industry actually on problems that they were facing. And by the late 90s, we had connected with some biotech companies in Boston, which were starting to work in genomics, and it was called the Genomics Collaborative Initiative. And they actually wanted a computational group to support them. And so we actually did this as a sponsored research project from the Indian Institute of Science. And in a way, it became kind of a consulting relationship between that company and us. Now, in this whole milieu, Bangalore was sort of heating up as an entrepreneurial sort of center. There was the IT industry was growing very rapidly, and I think the Indian Institute of Science had a new president of the court, Mr. Ratan Tata, who had come, I think, on board in 1999 as the president, and he actually made a comment saying, how come the Indian Institute of Science hasn't actually spun off companies and doesn't have a research park like you see at the great universities around the world. So I think that prompted us. We actually wrote a letter saying that the Perceptual Computing Lab was ready to spin off a couple of technology platforms, which we felt could become commercial ventures. And that was apparently the first time in India that professors had approached the university for permission to start companies, or maybe not the first time, but it became sort of a formal process for the first time. The Indian Institute of Science actually put a committee to look at this whole proposition. Took them about a year to resolve all the issues, but by October 2000, Strand was up and running. I mean, it was a registered company. And we were bootstrapping on the consulting that we were already doing. So we had some projects which we could transfer now into the company, which became sort of a revenue source. And so we never had to go out and look for seed funding, and we were able to just start up right away. In fact, we rented space outside campus. We rented the upstairs of a house and just set up Strand there. We actually built it up as an incubator. Now, meanwhile, there was a second startup brewing, which was the Simputer-related startup.
This was
Picopeta.
Picopeta.
So Pico for small, Peta for large. So small device having large impact. That was the etymology of the name. And so Picopeta was about ready to launch, and so about 6 months after Strand, that was started up. And so both of them shared the incubator that we had created called String Labs, and we started up as entrepreneurs. Now, I think one of the important things was we had in some ways I think that describes the whole academic path up to the point of where we started on this entrepreneurial journey.
Dr. Chandru, even today we often see that not a lot of academic faculties or personnel move into the industry. Personally, how was that journey for you? Was there any ever thought about the risks you were taking about moving away from the comfort of academia?
Well, at least initially, first of all, I think as someone who had worked at, it was a student at MIT, then later a faculty member at Purdue, I had watched a number of colleagues handle both. They were.
So I was actually that was my second question.
Okay,
how much did you feel that your training in America contributed to the comfort of moving to industry?
Yeah. So of course the US experience had, made me comfortable with the idea, right? Almost every faculty member I knew at MIT, or at least half of them, let's say, had their own companies that they had started up at some point, maybe spent a couple of years with the company and then come back to research, or many of them had never left research. They kind of managed to do both. So those were the role models. And so there was nothing scary about becoming an entrepreneur. I think there was obviously a sense that, we would be abandoning sort of the straight and narrow path of academic peer review and so on, because we were now be judged on completely different sort of performance metrics. Now, initially, at least, what I felt about entrepreneurship was that any active research professor actually is well equipped to become an entrepreneur. When you think about it, an active research program requires you to communicate well about the work you do, because you have to go out there and present and market your work in order to raise funding and so on. So you were also well trained in raising funding, because you needed to maintain your research program. You recruited people into your research program, and you learned how to manage them. So you had the management skills, at least from a human resource point of view. And
so every principal investigator in that sense is a one-person startup, right? And then they recruit PhD students and postdocs.
Absolutely. So I think they have the basic skills, right, that are needed for entrepreneurship. I think that little extra that's needed is really that willing to work with that intensity and that inexorable kind of clock that keeps ticking, right? And so that, I think, that's something that one needs to be prepared for, and one can modulate that. You can actually run a company more like a a lifestyle company, or you can actually choose to ride the tiger, and usually the difference between those two are that once you get investors on board, I think the whole game changes, because they are looking for an exit. They have a timetable for an exit, and so you have to accelerate everything. And at that point, things have to be much more focused than before. So the movement from academia into entrepreneurship was there. That was one change. The other is that, I think you don't have that luxury of being able to spend a lot of time on thinking or retraining yourself on something and so on. So it's essentially a compression of your time, and which is the hard switch. I think the idea of risk and uh, liability around building a company and so on. I think you have to take some early decisions on that. For example, one of the decisions we had taken were that we would never give personal guarantee to banks or financial institutions, because essentially there wasn't much to guarantee, right? And whatever little there was, we couldn't afford to risk it from a from a. Uh,
And this
so
was an era when India didn't have a bankruptcy law. I mean,
right,
actually
exactly.
closing a company is surprisingly difficult, right?
And
Starting one
most of us
itself is
had heard some horror stories of a
right.
relative who got hounded, because an entrepreneurial idea didn't go the way they wanted it to, and so on. So we were careful about that. So that was the only difficult part, because I think when you take a position like that, some bankers will work with you and others won't, and so on. But I think we stood by that, at least, in the early years when we didn't have that ability to take risk. So,
Dr. Chandru, I remember first hearing of Strand actually in about 2005 or 2006. I was an undergrad student then, and friend and a neighbor of mine got an internship at Strand Genomics, and I was very intrigued because it was a biology related company and I was studying biotechnology, but I then found out that Strand was only taking computer science interns. So my first sort of exposure to Strand as a student was, oh, they do some computational biology work, bioinformatics, and that was about
right,
the extent of knowledge I had as a student with very different
right.
research interests. So could you tell us a little about
Sure,
how
sure.
Strand evolved from four of you in an incubator with two companies and then more people coming in?
Sure. I think, let me first address this computer science bias, or that you experience. And Pavan, I'm sure you were very, very competent biotechnology student. But I think in the early days when we started on this whole journey in computational biology, we kind of had this feeling that we would not find a lot of people with both sets of skills, right?
Absolutely.
And so the whole idea of a bioinformatician or so on.
So, and I'll shamelessly admit that I studied more biosciences than any engineering.
But the challenge was that when we would look at bioinformaticians in those days, these were mainly people who assisted crystallographers and structural biologists. They were not really, that conversant with computer science, and didn't really think like computer scientists, algorithmically, so on. So we thought, we would sort of take this approach of hiring best in class in computer science and best in class in biology, and just making the two groups talk to each other and get past the jargon and so on, and be able to work together. And I think that was, an experiment that eventually paid off very well for Strand, but it had its challenges. And I think, for the first 10 years or so of Strand's journey, we did focus on software. We built, biology in those days actually didn't have the analytic tools it deserved. Um, molecular biology was accelerating. There were lots of very interesting high throughput techniques that were coming about. But, biology never had a math lab, right? There was a math lab that had been designed for the physical sciences, but biology didn't have a platform or a workbench, for being able to look at experimental data, and be able to, arrive at analytic results which would suggest how the next experiment should be carried out, etc. So that was a gap we saw, and in spite of some of the early computational biology companies, we talked about the ones in structural biology and so on, they weren't good companies doing looking at experimental data and doing that kind of data analytics, and particularly in the area of genomics. I think there was a lot of work going on high density microarrays, which was spewing out lots of information. Mass spectroscopy was starting to take off, but and the tools were just not around for that. And so we essentially saw an opportunity to build some of those tools, right? And that became the business plan on which Strand was able to raise venture funding in 2002, and then set off on. So we had a couple of years where we essentially did consulting, then sort of figured out what the market needed, and at that point raised venture capital, and then just got into a mode of building out the platform, which took almost a couple of years to build. And those were the early days of machine learning, and we built a lot of the machine learning technology into these platforms. And then we were able to start commercializing by about 2004.
Okay.
On the platform, and we and that was an interesting journey on its own, how we commercialized all of that. But the fact is that for those first 10 years, the company was entirely focused on tool building and using those tools to provide solutions and value-added services.
Could you give us a few examples?
Sure, yeah.
And how, if when they were commercializing, what kind of customers you had who were
Sure.
buying?
Absolutely, yeah. So biology in those days was largely, of course, at least the kind of biology we were looking at, genomics and so on, was largely in the mode that the human genome had been sequenced,
right,
and now it needed to be annotated. So, and those annotations had to come from experiments, right? And so research biology was essentially all about that, right? Or at least the research biology customers that we were talking to. There must have been about 5,000 labs around the world that were doing high throughput experiments, and therefore, were potential customers for us. We initially focused on high density microarrays and the data that was coming out of them to be able to, analyze the data, help the biologist or the bioinformatician in the group analyze the data.
This is mostly DNA sequence data, or
this was more expression data, so it was more, essentially RNA, related. But we essentially, once you identified the genes that were overexpressed or underexpressed in a particular sample, then the next question to ask was, what does this imply in terms of a pathway that these genes might be involved in? And so we built the tools that could take you all the way to mapping these onto pathways, visualizing the pathways, and then working with that. And so these platforms we initially called AVADIS, which was an acronym for Access, Visualize, Analyze to Discover. And we started trying to sell these on a annual subscription model, which was more or less the way most such shrink-wrapped technologies were being sold to the research community. And of course, we first went to the US market thinking that's the largest and that would be where we would want to make a mark. And we found it very difficult. the cost of sales were high, and it was also difficult to convince scientists to try out our platform versus others that they were using and so on. We must have been the second or third, player in the market by then. And then we had a lucky breakthrough, which was that the Japan Export Trade Office in Bangalore offered to us that they could provide us a beachhead in Japan, where we could launch our product in Japan. Right? So we went to Tokyo, and with their help, got a local interpreter and started, going to conferences and showing the platform and so on. And the Japanese are a very interesting, scientific community. They have a great appreciation of technology, and they're willing to pay for it. And selling in Japan is it's a ritual. It's not, it's not just business, right? There is a whole hierarchy of sales distribution that happens, and you have to, essentially learn that and interact with them, and go out and have dinners with them, and and really get into that whole culture, and that was a very interesting exercise, and it was certainly a lot easier than trying to walk door to door in the US and sell to NIH researchers and so on. So we actually put some intensity into that effort, and some big distributors picked us up, like Hitachi and Kurabo and so on. And within a year, they had translated all the, manuals and, help material into Japanese. They were running workshops, and we had captured about 20% of the market in Japan. Now, later we came to find out that Japan was actually 30% of the world's market. Right. So this was actually an interesting success we had. And this was in 2004, 2005. And at that point, the American competitors that we had sort of woke up to this little company in Bangalore that was creating this technology. And then they became our channel partners to go into the US. And the biggest partner was Adjunct, and that relationship, exists even today. That we build tools that their global sales force sells to scientific labs around the world. And at one point, I guess we had reached about maybe 2,000 labs around the world. So we were pretty close to 30 to 40% of the global market at that point. And that was very satisfying, and actually in many ways really sort of anchored the company and gave us sort of a foundation. And by about 2006 or so, we turned into a profitable company, which I think the investors were looking forward to. And then the clock started ticking, because, these investors needed to start thinking about exits and so on. So that, at some point we had to decide whether we were just going to be a bioinformatics company or turn Strand into something else, right? And that, in business terms, they call it a pivot, right?
Right.
So we came close to a pivot around 2010 or so. And that was when we saw precision medicine, or in those days they used to call it personalized medicine, as sort of the next opportunity for a company like Strand. And so this is all just to answer your question of why we were hiring computer scientists. But we were hiring computer scientists and biologists.
I was hoping that question will be enough of a provocation for this discussion.
Sure.
We'll be back with Vijay Chandru and Shambhavi Naik after this short break.
Hey Meghnad, do you know how to citizen?
Hey Shreyas, do you know how to citizen?
Hey Meghnad, do you know how to citizen?
Hey Shreyas, let's just do a podcast about it.
Let's do a podcast about it. A podcast is called How to Citizen. In every episode, we get a new guest and discuss one chapter from the 8th grade civics textbook. Think about it as three friends revising before a test, and we go back to school. There's nostalgia, there's trauma, there are lunch breaks, there are favorite teachers, there are horrible teachers, there's everything.
So every Tuesday, we bring in a guest on the podcast and we ask them a very simple question. Do you know how to citizen?
Meghnath, I think the question is, do you know how to citizen?
But Shreyas, I'm asking you this question. Do you know how to citizen?
Welcome back.
Dr. Chandru, so over the past many years, as you rightly pointed out, the tools that have been created and the research that has gone on in biology has increased our understanding of the genome by multifold. And we now stand at the helm of what is precision medicine, which is more and more looking likely to be the future of healthcare, especially from the point of view of creating affordable solutions for countries like ours. What do you see is in the future for precision medicine in India, and how do you place Strand in achieving that future?
Right. So I think, precision medicine is obviously a fantastic new development. And I think the fact that we can now look at, molecular markers, which actually will give some indication of the choice of best treatment and so on, is something that I think in principle should be thought of as, value that is in improved healthcare, right? And also in some sense reducing expense because, in some sense they are less likely to make errors in choice of treatments and so on. So I think that health economic value of precision medicine is yet to be understood clearly. And until that gets understood and accepted as an added value, I think it will not scale very easily, right? So for it to actually be adopted by the medical establishment, by public health initiatives and so on, I think that value needs to be established. And so in some sense, we are the early entrance into this. It's a market opportunity that needs to be made. It's not a ready market, right? And there's a lot of education involved. There's, particularly with the physician community to actually show them the value of what this is, because ultimately patients listen to what the physician tells them, right? And so and medical establishments are notoriously orthodox about how they stick to guidelines unless, there's sort of really strong evidence for them to change. They won't change. So it's been a slow process, but I think gradually in cancer care, now, there are some aspects of precision medicine that have become standard. Like for a lung cancer patient, you would start with an EGFR sort of profile, right? And because that treatment really can be, much more effective once you have that kind
particularly also in breast cancer, because we know there are so many subtypes and we can actually target them according to.
So could you simplify this a little more? I
Sure.
didn't get what EGFR was.
So EGFR is a particular gene, and depending on what mutations in that gene have driven the lung cancer. So you'd have to extract a biopsy from the tumor. In the case of lung, it will typically be a fine needle aspiration, and then study sort of the structure of the DNA in that gene and figure out where the mutations are or what the variants are that have caused.
So it's no longer that somebody has lung cancer of this type, so therefore here's a standard treatment.
Right, exactly.
But here's the actual mutations which have caused the cancer in this particular patient.
Right.
So that's the personalization.
That's
and
the personalization. And for breast cancer, for example, the hormone receptors, right? So, HER progesterone, estrogen. These are the markers that you would first look for, because again, they would define, the first steps of treatment. But you can get much more sophisticated about it. And the question was, can you actually go beyond just looking at one gene and a few specific mutations that are well known, or, maybe there are others, and the mapping exercise and the annotations that were happening were suggesting that it would be worthwhile to look at more of the genome at one go, so that you actually get the bigger picture.
Right. So in that sense, the precision medicine is about finding out what is causing the disease and development on how do you treat this, right? Yeah. So development needs to proceed on sort of both ends.
And it's not just a single answer. There may be several variants and several mutations going on, and there could be interactions going on. So, the bigger the picture that you start with, the more likely you are to understand, the effective use of treatment, right? But the question was, how much can you tax the patient? How do you take, would you take multiple biopsies? Sampling was obviously difficult and expensive, right? If you're doing multiple tests and so on. Now, fortunately, around 2006-07 is when this whole idea of doing next generation sequencing at the next level sort of showed up, right? It initially showed up in 2 or 3 different labs. I think there was a whole group at Yale who was working hard on it, and at Cambridge and in England. And the group in England actually developed a machine called Solexa, and the group at Yale developed 454. And these machines could actually do sequencing of multiple genes at a time, right? And they basically parallelized a lot of the operations that were being done by the earlier sequencing machines, the classical Sanger machines and so on. So it started looking feasible to work with a single sample and look at multiple sites, right, in the genome. By 2010, the technology had become very stable, and I think that's when this whole idea came about that, personalized medicine based on next-gen sequencing could actually be a very effective way in which things can proceed. It also started becoming clear that this would be an exponential law like Moore's law, that you would actually see a great speed up in this technology and a reduction of costs of processing samples that, will bring us closer and closer to the price points where this would make sense, as part of medical treatment, where the health economics would actually work out, right? And, I've written about this. I think basically genomics has reached what we call the second half of the chessboard. So genomics has reached today a speed up and a reduction in cost by a factor of 2 raised to the power 32.
Okay.
Right.
From
where it started.
So this
right?
Human Genome Project and before to now.
Oh, yeah, exactly. From the mid 80s when the first sequencers were developed, the Sanger sequencers.
Right. So the startup PCR.
The startup sequencing world to where we are today, right? So if you recall, the first human genome, they say roughly cost about $3 billion, but there was a lot of infrastructure involved there. The second human genome cost about $100 million. And today we know that it's roughly about $100 are the internal costs at the sequencing companies, the ones that make the instrument. They actually sell it for, 7-8 times that to the market. So they have a healthy profit margin, right? But I think, the competition is building up. So we can expect to see the $100 genome, right? Fairly, I would say within the next 5 years, right? For sure.
And already, if not the genome, but at least with genetic markers, it's a service that anyone can use, right? You have 23andMe and other things where
right.
you can sort of send in a
So I think
sample.
I think you need to qualify that a little bit.
Okay.
There are lots of companies that can run what are called arrays. That was the older technology, and give you some reports based on that. But that's not getting the really full detail of a sequencing. Now today you can run, let's say, an array with that can catch maybe 500,000 mutations, which are single nucleotide polymorphisms, for about $50.
Okay.
Right.
That's $50.
Right.
Not for the company, but for an individual.
$50 to $60 would be the running costs in the lab and putting out the data and so on. Mm-hmm. Now, what you actually charge for the test,
that's a different thing.
That has other sort of costs attached to it, sales and so on.
Right.
So many companies that put out reports that are based on more of these arrays will actually price them, much lower. So again, you can get a special on 23andMe for $99. Sometimes sometimes it's $200, sometimes $300. Right. I believe I paid $400 when it was, that was in the early days and so on. So, but they do these SNP arrays. I think, for doing sequencing and sequencing based tests, you can do targeted panels which only do the few relevant genes for, let's say, if you're looking at hereditary factors for cancer, right? We know that for breast and ovarian cancer, there's somewhere around 13, 14 genes that need to be actually sequenced. We are able to do that for about 15,000 rupees today, right? And that requires a lot of optimizations and so on, but that's the final cost to the patient or to the payer, whoever that may be. So now that's about $200. I think now will that come down to $100? Probably, once the volumes go up and these instrument companies have enough competition between themselves that they bring down the cost of reagents and so on that are involved. So, and I believe at that price point, somewhere between 5 and 10,000 rupees, we could see adoption on a larger scale through, if the clinical value of the test is high, right?
Right. So, and already in India, about 15 to 20% of all healthcare costs, government, private, everything put together, go towards diagnostics.
Right.
And many people are comfortable paying thousands of rupees for detailed blood tests.
Sure.
So I think anyone with a cancer risk is willing to pay. And
right.
I think
it's kind of interesting. I think, and it also ultimately, this whole insurance model and what insurance will cover and so on will dictate a lot of those decisions.
And a big question is, can and should insurance cover diseases that now will all be considered pre-existing conditions or could be considered pre-existing conditions because you have a genetic basis for it, right? And it's ethical.
That's a big one. That's a big one, and it's a big challenge in India with, of course, the fact that our IRDA actually the act actually specifically says that genetic predisposition does not need to be honored, by insurers. So, and that of course was questioned in the Delhi High Court and then went up for ruling in Supreme Court. So I think that's going to be an evolving battle.
Absolutely.
But I think we I think there are clearly going to be situations where some tests will get covered and reimbursed and others will not. And the US has been that way as well. And if you sort of follow what has happened there, I think, Medicare has not been willing to cover everything right from the beginning. And I think the onus is on the diagnostic companies to provide the clinical evidence and so, it's not as expensive as proving a new drug, but proving a new diagnostic also involves a fair amount of R&D expense because, you will still need to prove this clinical worthiness to be able to qualify for the reimbursement. So I think the expansion of this whole precision medicine is going to hinge on all of these factors, but I think we will move towards it. And as you point out, I think what we felt was that people were willing to pay for PET scans, right? Which cost somewhere in that 15,000 to 20,000 bracket. So we said, if we can bring the cost of some of these tests to under that number, I think, at least the patient doesn't have the sticker shock of a test costing, something that they'd never dreamed of.
Right.
Now, today, I think the cost of genuine sort of genomic tests, not the array kind, but full-fledged sort of NGS-based tests, varies from around 15,000 going all the way up to maybe a lakh of rupees or more. And it's a tough choice. And today only a small segment of the population is really sort of, or physicians actually are comfortable prescribing such a test because of the cost involved. But I think as diagnostic companies go, I think they would, it's kind of difficult today to build a diagnostic business in a country like India that is purely based on next generation sequencing. And so most diagnostic companies will have a mixed array of tests because I think we have to also look at what the medical establishment is comfortable today with and provide all of those tests. So Strand has gone that path as well. It's become a broad-based diagnostic company now with 850 employees, but now over 27 labs to be precise. I think around the country doing histopathology, histochemistry, just classic pathology, biochemistry tests, and then going into the more sophisticated and specialized tests, all the way up to next-gen sequencing. So,
Chandru, is this something very similar to what happened in breast cancer when we first started having screening?
Right.
And with increased screening, there was a lot of impact on survival of breast cancer because we were just picking up cancers earlier. Do you foresee that in the next few years, genomics-based diagnostics would become as common and acceptable as something like screening? You get it into into a health package.
Right. So today, what we are doing in screening is the only thing that we are really doing that could be called kind of screening is in families where there is family history of, let's say, breast and ovarian cancer, maybe particularly in family members, immediate family members who were below the age of 50 or 45 or so. Then there's a fairly high risk factor that you associate with healthy individuals from that family. And therefore, you might want to test them to see if they have hereditary factors. That's a kind of a screening test, right? The other kind of screening test that we do a fair amount of is in families where, maybe the first child was born with some genetic disorder. And now they're planning the family again, and they want, to have the fetus tested, right? or the parents want to know, what genetic factors they are carrying, which could be passed on to the fetus. So these types of tests are starting to happen. I think the great sort of breakthrough that we're going to see in screening based on genomics in cancer, we can see this happening, right? Is that you have cell-free tumor DNA that spills into the blood, right? So essentially tumor cells apoptose and they spill their guts into the blood, right? And so there'll be DNA fragments in there, and our ability now to actually read signal from those DNA fragments is improving by leaps and bounds, right? And today we are able to detect cancer mutations in the blood for stage 1 and early stage 2 cancer patients. We're able to detect it about 35% of the time, right? Once they get to stage 3, we're able to do it about 70+%.
These are for solid tumors.
These are for solid tumors today, right? So, this is what is called liquid biopsy, right? And this is from blood. There are also some ideas with saliva and with urine and so on, where other types of liquid biopsy tests are being developed. And my sense is that these will become affordable and can become screening processes, screening tests that can be, then offered on a population-wide scale. And my sense is that India and China will play a leadership role in these, because I think we actually have this challenge that we have very large populations of diseased patients, and the more we can do on the preventive side or early diagnosis, early detection, I think our healthcare systems can cope with that. We cannot go the way the West has with, throwing a lot of resources at the end of life kind of situations. But what we can do is throw a lot of resources on trying to catch things early. And so this is a major sort of research thrust at Strand that we have been working hard on developing these liquid biopsy tests. Our first paper has come out in Cancer Medicine, but I think again, there's obviously an interest in this, not just in India and China, but the West is doing a lot of work, and one of the most exciting companies there, called Grail, is doing some very large trials right now, where they're studies, I would say, where they've selected, I think, 12,000 women whose mammograms show some suspicious activity, and therefore they're now following them with liquid biopsy. Not to actually make clinical decisions, but to see the correlates of how many of them actually end up with disease, and what the correlates with the liquid biopsies are. So once they establish cases on such large cohorts, then I think the medical community will be willing to accept these as proper screening ideas. So I think some types of cancer will certainly be managed much better in the years to come because of the availability of these types of screening tests. Right?
So, Dr. Chandru, I'm sure we've just scratched the surface of everything that Strand has been up to, all that you've been up to over the last decade and a half, or 2 decades now, around even at Strand. But could you tell us a little bit about your involvement in industry and academia outside of Strand? I mean, you've been quite instrumental. Now we have an association of biotech-led industries, which is, I'd say, a fairly successful organization in promoting more biotech entrepreneurship and more companies going to scale in India. And you've also been a part of many advisory committees, both at the government of Karnataka and the government of India level. So could you tell us a little about how that started?
So I think, I think as far as ABLE and, Karnataka and biotech, largely, I would say, around the country is concerned, I think it was around the time that Strand started that really we saw this wave of biotechnology building up. And in many ways, Karnataka and Bangalore was one of the centers, and certainly the most important one, where, a lot of activity began. Hyderabad was probably another center where there was some initial activity. But I think in those early days, Kiran Mazumdar and there was Vilu Morwala Patel, who was starting Avestagen. She had just come out of NCBS, and then we had started Strand, and Varaprasad Reddy in Hyderabad who was building Shanta Biotech, right? And he was working on the hepatitis B vaccine. He was also funded by the Technology Development Board and others because of the kind of impact this kind of biotechnology was going to have. And so the four of us actually started ABLE. And this was, I think, around 2003 or so was when ABLE was created. And I think the idea was that we had seen in the information technology sector, NASSCOM as a very effective organization that had represented the industry in its early days and helped the industry, interact with government and policy, and so on. And we sort of did a copycat thing with biotech and ABLE. I think in addition to ABLE, which became sort of an industry, the apex body for the biotech industry, Karnataka had this idea of a vision group for biotechnology. And that's a fairly unique concept in India, that government, industry, and academia sit around the table.
Right.
And actually engage in joint decision making, which essentially the government representatives there, in this case it would be the principal secretary in charge of biotechnology, essentially uses this council to drive action, right? And so it actually moves extremely fast in this state, that we will have a discussion and then fairly soon we would see it implemented. And for that reason, I think Bangalore has become kind of the biotech hub of India. Right? We are actually today, I think, maybe between 30 and 40% of the biotech industry in India is based in Bangalore. Not necessarily by volume, but just in terms of number of startups and
Right.
and some of the bigger manufacturing outfits are spread out over the country, but I think here you would actually see a lot of innovation-driven startups coming up very, very quickly. So I do think this sector, a little bit more than say information technology, still requires the public agencies, the government, and so on, to be involved, because this is a slightly more regulated sector, and it has to be a more regulated sector. You cannot have laissez-faire, business going on in anything to do with health eventually. Right?
Yeah, the threat of harm is much higher
The
than
threat
software.
of harm is much higher. And of course, there's also some sensitivity about agriculture, monocultures and so on. So,
Right.
so there is, so these sectors are regulated, and I think there is a reason for government to be more engaged. And So from that point of view, I think this vision group is a core idea of Karnataka, which I think other states have obviously heard of and tried to emulate, but somehow has not happened in the same spirit. And we have one for information technology as well. But I get the sense that the information technology is not so deeply engaged with academia. I think in general that's true of the whole enterprise of information technology in this, particularly in Bangalore that I've seen. The engagement with academia is not strong. And it's an unusual thing because there is actually strong academia as well, but somehow that has not happened. Why, we see a much stronger link between Microsoft research in India with IISc than we see with IT companies and IISc, right? So it's somehow the multinational research groups, whether it was Bell Labs or Microsoft Research and so on, they have seen the academic link as important, but our own IT industry has not built that. So as a consequence, you actually see that, in some sense, it is more of an industry-driven agenda for the most part that happens in information technology. There isn't too much of participation from academia.
Thank you, Dr. Chandru. It's also great to see sort of you also come full circle where you're now back at IISc as well as a distinguished technologist. I've really enjoyed taking your epidemiology course, and it's great to, and thank you for coming on the show to talk to us about your journey.
So yeah, I've gone back to IISc, but not as a hardcore computer scientist.
Absolutely.
I now feel committed to the life sciences and particularly to healthcare. And I think, in this sort of superannuated phase of my career, I think I would like to continue to work in healthcare related areas, and epidemiology seems to be a good starting point where, I think the computational background, again fits in with a healthcare sort of emphasis. So, thank you for having me. I think it's been a very enjoyable interaction.
Thanks, Dr. Chandru.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. The Pragati Podcast is now on Instagram. Follow us at Pragati Pod. That's PRAGATIPOD. If you listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It will mean a lot to us. Send us an email at haratepod@gmail.com with any questions and comments, and visit thinkpragati.com for your daily dose of brain fodder. You can subscribe to the Pragati Podcast on the all-new IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from. We are there everywhere.
How aware do you think you are of your laws and rights? Do you look up to laws when you are caught up in situations? Do you know what your rights are when you're stuck somewhere bad? Well, here's a show that can help you move an inch closer to being aware of what your rights are. Tune into Know Your Qanoon with me, Amber Rana. This is a podcast meant to answer all your law-related queries. Catch Know Your Qanoon every week on the IVM website or the app or anywhere you get your podcast from.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!